Our next panel, Fireside Chat, a prosecutor's perspective, will include Liz Komar and Marilyn Mosby, and that will start here in just a moment. Looks like we have both of you here. I'll pass this along to Liz. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And so I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Fair and Just Prosecution, a national nonprofit which works to transform the criminal legal system by supporting elected prosecutors committed to a new vision of justice. And we have the privilege of working with State's Attorney Mosby. So thank you, State's Attorney Mosby, for joining us. And for anyone unfamiliar, which is hard at this point, on January 8th, 2015, State's Attorney Mosby was sworn in as the 25th State's Attorney for Baltimore City, making her the youngest chief prosecutor of any major American city, after successfully completing one of the largest upsets in Baltimore City election history. She assumed office and immediately transformed the office into a national model for progressive, holistic prosecution. And as we'll talk about during this panel, a hallmark of her term has been her vigorous criticism of the war on drugs and her embrace of decriminalization and harm reduction as a path to improving equity, public safety, and community well-being. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Good to see you, Liz.
Good to see you. And before we turn to our conversation, just a little background on today's convening for those who may have not attended prior sessions. So the US is in the midst of a deadly overdose crisis. Fatal overdoses have been on the rise for several years, reaching a record peak of over 81,000 drug overdose deaths in the 12 months prior to May 2020. In response to that increase, in 2018, the DEA, under President Trump, decided that fentanyl analogues should be treated differently than other analogues. It used its temporary scheduling authority to take the unprecedented step of adding a class of substances that are structurally similar to fentanyl to Step 1 of the Controlled Substances Act. This class-wide ban means that any substance that the DEA deems to fall within the class definition is placed on Schedule 1, with no scientific or health justification needed. Many analogs that either posed no harm to human health or could be therapeutic were swept up in the ban and are now subject to federal prosecution. After a temporary extension in February 2020, that class-wide ban now expires in May 2021. Meanwhile, federal prosecutions involving illicit fentanyl have increased more than 4,000%, and roughly 75% of those cases have involved people of color. But those prosecutions haven't halted the tide of overdoses. Synthetic opioid overdose deaths have in fact dramatically increased. In the 12 months prior to May 2020, synthetic opioids caused 38.4% more fatal overdoses than in the prior 12-month period. And so the unscientific fentanyl exceptionalism fueling this class-wide ban should feel familiar because it echoes the crack cocaine exceptionalism of the 1980s. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which created the infamous 100-to-1 powder crack cocaine disparity, dramatically deepening racial disparities in the federal criminal justice system, tearing apart families and communities with no scientific basis. So I'm honored to have the opportunity to ask State's Attorney Mosby to share her thoughts on the impact of the drug war in Baltimore, her innovative drug policy reform work, and her insights on the just path forward. And so turning to those lessons learned, in 2019, you testified before a US House panel and said, "There's no better illumination of this country's failed war on drugs than the city of Baltimore, Maryland." Why is that the case, and how have you seen that play out as a prosecutor?
So I appreciate your question, Liz. And I said that in context of marijuana legalization, but it most certainly applies to drug policy more generally, right? Since the era of Nixon, then Reagan, and for decades, we have fought a war on drugs, which was later professed to be, by Nixon aide John Ehrlichman, really a war on Black people. He professed that there were two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. And quote unquote, we knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or being Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them. That is important, criminalizing them both heavily. We could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders. We could raid their homes. We could break up their meetings and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This was an aid to the White House at the start and the inception of this war on drugs that we're still fighting against. And that's exactly what they did, right? They were able to disrupt communities. And you look at a place like Baltimore, where almost 70% of the city's population is Black, 28% of Baltimore's population lives in poverty, 35% of children live below poverty. There are over 18,000 vacant houses, 16,000 vacant lots. The unemployment rate for young African-American men between the ages of 18 and 24 is more than twice as high than that of whites. When you see cities like Baltimore, communities of color decimated by this war on drugs, you can't help but understand and recognize that the targeting, the prosecution, the tough sentences that were imposed mostly upon people of color contributed to the cyclical sort of crime driven by the collateral consequences of those convictions. So you had children who lost their parents to the system. We exacerbating the poverty. And most strikingly, all of this approach, it had absolutely nothing to do with reducing drug use, right? It didn't reduce drug use. So one of my predecessors, and I highlight Baltimore because it is, you know, it's a microcosm of what we've done. It's a perfect example of what we've done and how that failure of the war on drugs has been all across this country. My predecessor, Mayor and mentor Kurt Schmoke, was a mayor in Baltimore in the 1980s, and he was one of the first leaders to realize the damage that they were doing in real time with this approach. And he stated America's war on drugs was a domestic Vietnam, and he was vilified for that, right? So as my role as a prosecutor, I'm the one who decides who's going to be charged, what they're going to be charged with, what sentence recommendations we're going to make. We determine whether or not somebody's going to get into the criminal justice system in the first place. Our mission is justice over convictions, and ethically, we are supposed to right the wrongs of the past. And so that is the approach that I've taken in this role, and the approach that I think more prosecutors should across this country.
Thank you. What have you been doing to right those wrongs?
So, I mean, there's a number of things that we've been doing, and in addition to taking a very sort of non-traditional approach to prosecution. We don't have like a case processing office, right? We've taken a holistic approach. In 2019, this war on drugs was understanding the data, right? When we look at these issues, I was one of the first prosecutors in the country to come out and have one of the most progressive marijuana policies. I came out and basically said, regardless of size or amount, regardless of criminal history, we are no longer prosecuting mere possession of marijuana. And the reason why is that we know that there's no disparate use among white and Black people. However, if you're Black in this country, you're 4 times more likely to be arrested for mere possession of marijuana. And in the city of Baltimore, you were 6 times more likely. And even after we decriminalized 10 grams or less of marijuana, the 42% of the citations that were being issued were issued in 1 out of 9 police districts, which happened to be 95% Black and disproportionately impoverished. Well, I came out after, assessment, and we did a full white paper and justification, my team, and looked at, what was happening, legalization all across the country. And what we realize is that there's absolutely no public safety value in this prosecution. Those places that have legalized, there hasn't been a drastic increase in violence. It's counterproductive to the limited resources that we have in law enforcement. At the time in 2019, our clearance rate was less than 26%. Homicide clearance rate, meaning the cases that we solve. So we're only solving 1 out of 4 homicides. We should be using those resources for the bad guys, the really bad guys, not these individuals that are being discriminately enforced. These laws are being discriminately enforced against. And last but certainly not least, to that point, I came out and said I'm not going to be complicit in the discriminatory enforcement of these laws against poor Black and brown people, while there are certain individuals who are making millions of dollars off of this industry at this point. I will no longer criminalize Black people for this. And what we've seen is that the police initially were resistant. I've worked with 5 police commissioners in 5 years, but they have gotten on board. And we were able to reallocate resources and to expand upon our homicide unit. And we haven't seen a drastic increase. And that was one of the things that we did. We also have one of the first, I created a crime control and prevention division within my office to be able to break the school to prison pipeline and to ensure that we're addressing the needs of those individuals that are stuck with a felony conviction. Because we know once you get one, you can no longer apply for a job, no longer apply for housing, can't go back to school because you can't get any financial aid. And then what other recourse do you have but to go out doing what you were doing in the first place? So we modeled a program and created an aim to be more program that was modeled after Kamala Harris's Back on Track program, where we're taking young people, first-time felony drug offenders, and allowing them to go through a probationary period where they learn life skills, they learn job training skills, they do community service, and at the end of that probationary period, they're given a job and their felony records are wiped clean. And last but certainly not least, around this whole war on drugs, is that we focused in this past year. In March, at the height of the COVID pandemic, we consulted with public health experts all across the country. And what we understood very early on was that this jail, and it actually turned out to be true, was going to be an incubator for this virus and had the potential of exacerbating the virus. And so we came out and looking at what was happening all across the country following the George Floyd and everything, and even before that. But what we know is that these low-level offenses have nothing to do with public safety. You look at what happened in George Floyd, right? You have an individual who allegedly passed a counterfeit bill during a global pandemic for groceries. You know, you look at Eric Garner allegedly selling a loose cigarette. Sandra Bland failed to put on a turn signal. All of these low-level offenses for Black people in this country can end up being a death sentence. And so what we did, and after consulting those public health experts, is to set our own decarceral guidelines. And we came out and we basically said, we're not going to prosecute drug possession. We're not going to prosecute sex work and prostitution. We're not going to prosecute disorderly conduct and these low-level traffic offenses. Again, for those individuals that can, for Black people in this country, could lead to a death sentence that has no public safety value, is counterproductive to the limited resources that we have. And so what we've been able to show from that data in the past year is that we've been able to reduce the number of individuals going in and out of the jail by 35%. The number of drug arrests, the police conformed with our policies, have decreased by 80%. And the actual violent crime rate has decreased last year by 30%. The only thing that stayed on the same par was the shootings and the murders, but they did not increase. They were on par with what they were before, which ultimately we believe is indicative of the fact that we should have never been prosecuting these cases and allowing the police to respond to every social ill of society and criminalizing these offenses in the first place.
Thank you. And in our last 2 minutes, just to kind of tie us back to the theme of the convening, you know, you do still treat fentanyl and fentanyl analog cases very seriously. You prosecute them, and unlike many of the advocates of class-wide scheduling who have falsely argued that ending it would somehow legalize fentanyl analogs, which is wrong, that's also clearly not your goal. So why do you oppose class-wide scheduling?
So the one thing I will say is that we have to be extremely careful, right? We kind of learned our lessons before, and we learned our lesson with the, as you already mentioned, the crack epidemic. We don't want to treat this, and this is a very bad substance that has affected not just inner cities in America, but the suburbs, which is possibly one of the reasons why we're talking about it from a public health perspective and no longer looking to criminalize it in the first place. But we have to be really careful and learn from the lessons of the past. And so, you know, from that perspective, we need to treat it the same way that we do from a public health and perspective and a lens and a harm reduction lens. That's one of the reasons why, you know, I've advocated for safe injection sites. I had the awesome opportunity of being able to go with my colleagues from across the country to Germany and Portugal with fair and just prosecution, and to learn and see the impact of, you know, decriminalization of drugs. And that is something that, you know, their entire criminal justice system was totally different from ours. It was a level of respect and human dignity and, quite candidly, compassion that we do not exhibit for those individuals in our country. And we should always hearken back to the lessons of the past and remember the impetus of this war and the criminalization of substance use disorder, which is a war on Black people and the war on drugs.
Thank you, State's Attorney Mosby. And thank you for your time today. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to the facilitators.